Welcome and thank you for joining me tonight for another story meant to unfold slowly, like candlelight spreading across a darkened room. As the world outside stills, this is your invitation to settle in, breathe deeply, and take a quiet journey with me into the recesses of history. Somewhere between fact and legend lies the tale I will share tonight. But before we begin, I invite you to imagine this. All of us, scattered across cities, time zones, and continents, yet sharing this very moment. Some listening in the hush of midnight, others as dawn tiptoes through their curtains. Wherever you are, I'm glad you're here. For tonight's chapter, let me introduce you to a woman who wore many names: daughter, wife, mother, queen. But history would remember her as something else entirely: the Poison Regent. Her true name was Isabella Valmont. And though she was not born to rule, she rose to command one of the most powerful thrones in Europe. Her path to power was not lined with roses. It was paved with betrayal, humiliation, calculation, and if the whispers are to be believed, more than a little poison. This is her story. Picture Florence in 1519, the streets a symphony of contradictions. The fragrance of incense spilling from cathedral doors, mingling with the sharp tang of sweat from the markets. Ink-stained apprentices rushing past marble workshops where statues rose like frozen saints. Gold clinking in the hands of bankers, even as the clang of iron echoed from armories. Florence was a jewel of the Renaissance, but it was also a city forever balanced on the edge of a dagger. It was here that Isabella Valmont first drew breath. She came into the world swaddled in silk, yet orphaned almost at once. Her parents, prosperous bankers, died within weeks of her birth. Typhus, the doctors said. Poison, whispered others. Whatever the truth, their deaths left behind an infant who was rich in coin but poor in love. And in Florence, wealth without lineage was a cage disguised as luxury. Servants cradled her, but their loyalty was bought. Tutors polished her manners, but every lesson was meant to increase her worth on the marriage market. From the cradle, Isabella was treated less as a child and more as a pawn. Imagine a girl raised with constant reminders that she was not royalty, merely a merchant's daughter. Every gift she received was tallied, every kindness weighted with expectation. She learned to smile on command, to bow at the right angle, to hide the sting of mockery behind lowered eyes. Her childhood was not about freedom, it was about preparation. At 14, that preparation bore fruit. A marriage contract arrived like a verdict. She was to leave Florence, cross the mountains into France, and wed Antoine Valois, the second son of King Francis I. It was not a love match. No one pretended it was. France wanted the Valmont coffers. The Valmonts wanted a foothold in royal bloodlines. Isabella was the coin that sealed the bargain. Now close your eyes and picture her arrival. A young girl stepping into the vaulted halls of the French court, her satin slippers clicking nervously against marble floors polished until they shone like mirrors. Behind her trailed a dowry so immense it could bankroll armies. Ahead of her stretched rows of courtiers, their eyes sharp as razors. To them she was an outsider. Her accent marked her as foreign, her manners as provincial. They whispered when she passed, the banker's daughter. Some even laughed aloud, daring her to hear. Every smirk was a reminder that no matter how rich her silks, she would never be one of them. Antoine, her husband-to-be, was polite enough, cordial even, but his eyes wandered and his heart remained elsewhere. For Isabella, indifference cut deeper than cruelty, and for 10 long years their marriage bore no children. Each empty cradle became another weapon in the court's arsenal of whispers. Cursed, they muttered. Barren, perhaps even punished by God for daring to sit among queens. Most women would have broken. Isabella did not. Instead, she turned to study. While other ladies embroidered, she asked questions of apothecaries. While they played lute and sang, she slipped away to read texts banned by priests and passed hand to hand in Florence's alleys. She learned of herbs that coaxed fertility, powders that calmed fevers, and tinctures that stilled hearts. She learned patience, drop by drop, leaf by leaf. Knowledge became her true dowry. And then mysteriously, those who mocked her most viciously began to fall ill. Not dead, not yet, but weakened. Fevers struck, voices faltered, rashes bloomed on proud faces. Courtiers began to lower their eyes when Isabella entered a room. Respect did not come, but fear did. And sometimes fear was better. Then at last in 1544, a miracle. Isabella conceived, once, then again, and again. Between 1544 and 1557 she bore 10 children. The court that had laughed at her empty womb now whispered in awe. Was it divine favor, or was it Isabella's growing mastery of remedies and secrets? No one knew, but children, princes and princesses were undeniable proof of her worth. And with each birth, Isabella's position strengthened. She was no longer merely the banker's daughter. She was the mother of future kings. By the time Anton ascended the throne in 1547, Isabella had achieved what few believed possible: survival, influence, and the loyalty of a bloodline. Yet her crown was ornamental. Power, real power, still eluded her. For while she bore the title of queen consort, another woman, Anton's mistress, held the king's ear, his treasury, and his heart. It would take patience, cunning, and the shadows she had already begun to master for Isabella Valmont to step from pawn to player. The crown may glitter, but it can also cut. For Isabella Valmont, the crown of France was never a gift. It was a cage lined with jewels, one she would learn to pry open with patience, calculation, and poison. Tonight, we step deeper into her story, at the very moment when humiliation could have broken her. Instead, it made her dangerous. For 10 long years, Isabella endured whispers about her barrenness. Courtiers pitied Anton, her husband, and muttered that France deserved better than an Italian banker's daughter who couldn't deliver an heir. The word divorce hovered like a storm cloud. But then in 1544, a miracle. Isabella conceived. Against all expectations, she delivered a healthy son. Relief swept through the court, but more astonishing still, she conceived again and again. Over 13 years, she bore 10 children, filling cradles faster than anyone could count. The court's tone shifted. Had heaven relented? Or had Isabella's strange studies in alchemy and the occult produced results? The whispers about poison grew louder, now joined by whispers about potions that cured infertility. Isabella only smiled. She never confirmed, never denied. Let the court wonder, uncertainty was a sharper weapon than certainty could ever be. In 1547, Anton's father, King Francis I, died. Anton ascended, and Isabella became queen consort. But if Isabella expected her crown to buy her dignity, she was wrong. Anton's heart belonged elsewhere. Madame Seraphine. She was nearly 20 years Isabella's senior, a woman of striking poise who had once guided Anton through his boyhood. Now she guided him in everything else, from matters of state to matters of bed. She wasn't just a mistress, she was an institution. When ambassadors arrived at court, they were advised, speak first to Seraphine. She knew the king's moods, his weaknesses, his whims. Isabella, the lawful queen, was reduced to a ceremonial figure. She produced heirs, attended feasts, and endured the pitying glances of nobles who knew the truth. France already had a queen, and her name was not Isabella. Imagine the scene. A glittering banquet in the grand hall of Fontainebleau. The long tables groan under the weight of roasted swan, sugared fruits, and gilded goblets of Burgundy wine. The king sits at the head of the table, Seraphine at his right hand, the place reserved for a queen. Isabella sits further down, near her children, ignored like an afterthought. Laughter erupts as Anton whispers something to Seraphine. She tilts her head, her pearls swaying, her smile radiant. The courtiers join in, eager to flatter the mistress. Isabella lifts her goblet, her face serene, but inside she burns. Every laugh is a lash. Every jewel on Seraphine's gown feels like stolen treasure. But Isabella does not let the fire consume her. She banks it, hides it, keeps it smoldering. She has learned patience, and patience is the seed of vengeance. That vengeance would not arrive by her hand, but by fate. In June of 1559, Paris erupted in celebration. Isabella's eldest daughter, Elizabeth, was to marry the King of Spain. To honor the marriage, Antoine declared a grand jousting tournament. The lists were set up near the Bastille. Banners snapped in the wind, drums rolled, and the smell of horses mixed with summer dust. The people cheered as their king entered the arena in gleaming armor. Isabella sat in the stands, her children clustered around her. Beside her, as always, was Seraphine, radiant in velvet. The mistress's fingers glittered with rings, gifts from Antoine, gifts that should have been Isabella. The king chose to ride against a young, spirited opponent. The first pass was clean. On the second, disaster struck. The opponent's lance shattered on impact, splinters exploding like deadly confetti. A jagged shard pierced Antoine's visor, driving into his eye, then deeper, into his brain. Gasps swept the stands. The king toppled from his horse. For 10 days, Antoine lingered in agony. Surgeons tried everything: poultices, cauterization, prayers whispered over his broken body. Nothing worked. He cried out in delirium, clutching at Seraphine's hands, sometimes at Isabella. His final days were a grotesque tug-of-war between wife and mistress, queen and usurper. On the 10th day, his cries fell silent. Antoine was dead. The throne passed to his son, Francis, barely 15, but everyone knew the truth. France was now governed by the Queen Mother, Isabella. Seraphine wept theatrically at the funeral, but she knew her time was over. The new king's loyalty lay with his mother, not his father's mistress. For the first time, Isabella stood free of her rival's shadow. But shadows have a way of returning. Young King Francis had a bride, Lady Marion of Scotia, barely 16 but already dazzling. She was beautiful, clever, and adored by the people. Her family, the powerful House of Guise, saw her marriage as their opportunity to dominate French politics. The Guises dismissed Isabella as they always had, a foreigner, a merchant's daughter, tolerated only because she had given birth to heirs. They whispered to Francis that his mother was overbearing, superstitious, dangerous. They pushed Marion into the spotlight, hoping to sideline Isabella entirely. But Isabella had not endured decades of humiliation to yield now. At first, she smiled sweetly at the Guises. She played the part of the docile mother, attending councils, nodding quietly, biding her time. And then, curiously, members of the Guise faction began to fall ill. One collapsed during a hunt, clutching his throat. Another wasted away with fevers, his skin blotched and mottled. A third died suddenly at a banquet, choking on air itself. No one dared accuse Isabella directly, but the whispers grew. The Queen Mother knows her herbs too well. The Guises took note, so did the rest of the court. Respect, or perhaps fear, returned to Isabella. But triumph turned swiftly to tragedy. In December of 1560, young King Francis developed a painful swelling near his ear. Physicians called it an infection. Prayers were said, relics kissed. But within weeks, Francis was dead. He was 16 years old. Lady Marion's crown crumbled with his. No longer Queen of France, she returned to Scotland in grief and bitterness. The Guise family's influence weakened with her departure. And in the empty space left behind, Isabella stepped forward. Her second son, Charles, only 10 years old, was now king. Too young to rule, he required a regent, and Isabella claimed that role with both hands. For the first time, she ruled not in the shadows but openly. Her enemies gave her a name, La Regent and Poisonous, the Poison Regent. To some it was an insult. To Isabella it was a crown forged from fear. She built a network of informants who reported every whisper in the kingdom. She filled her household with Italian alchemists and astrologers, advisors whose knowledge was as esoteric as it was feared. Most infamous of all, she created what would later be known as the Flighting Squadron, a circle of strikingly beautiful young women trained not in courtly manners but in espionage. Their weapons were charm, wit, and seduction. Their targets, ambassadors, nobles, rivals. Secrets were coaxed from bedsheets, alliances reshaped by candlelight, and when necessary, poisons delivered with a kiss. Through them, Isabella turned the French court into a theater of shadows. At the same time, she began shaping young Charles. Other queens might have taught him prayer, diplomacy, or benevolence. Isabella taught him ruthlessness. She showed him how to smile at an enemy across the banquet table, then sign their death warrant by dawn. She told him mercy was weakness, trust a luxury, conscience a trap. Charles absorbed her lessons eagerly. Under her tutelage, he became a king in body, but in spirit her creation. So ends this chapter of Isabella Valmont's story, from the humiliated queen consort, overshadowed by a mistress, to the grieving widow who seized regency, to the poison regent who ruled through fear, whispers, and shadows. But her greatest test was still to come. France was a kingdom divided, its seams tearing under the weight of religion, Catholics against Protestants, brother against brother, and Isabella, seated at the center, held the match that could ignite it all. By the early 1570s, France was a nation balanced on a knife's edge. In the cobblestone streets of Paris, the smell of fresh bread from the bakeries mixed with the metallic tang of blood. Fistfights broke out between Catholics and Protestants in marketplaces. Sermons thundered from pulpits, each side declaring the other damned. Whole villages had been burned, their charred beams standing like blackened ribs against the sky. And at the center of this storm sat Isabella Valmont, the Poison Regent. For years she had managed division like a skilled card player, sliding favors to Catholics when their strength was needed, whispering tolerance to Protestants when peace suited her. She had kept the kingdom in a controlled chaos, believing that while her enemies tore at each other, none would grow strong enough to challenge her directly. But the game was turning. The Protestants, or Huguenots as they were called, were no longer scattered voices. They were an organized force, with fortified cities, wealthy merchants, and noble commanders. Most dangerous of all, they had found a leader whose very name made Isabella's heart beat colder. Admiral Lucien Moreau. Moreau was no ordinary noble. Tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes that seemed to see through flattery, he had built his reputation on both the battlefield and the council chamber. Soldiers trusted him because he bled with them. Statesmen respected him because he spoke with honesty rare in court. He was incorruptible, and that alone made him dangerous. Even more threatening, King Charles adored him. The young king, barely into his 20s, found in Moreau a father figure he had never truly had. Where Isabella whispered caution and intrigue, Moreau spoke of honor and reform. He encouraged Charles to see himself not as a pawn of factions, but as a monarch who could unite France. To a restless young man eager to step from his mother's shadow, it was intoxicating. And to Isabella, it was intolerable. Imagine her chamber in the Louvre, tapestries drawn to muffle sound, a fire burning low. Isabella sits at her writing desk, her fingers ink-stained, her letters spreading across the table like a spider's web. Reports from her informants whisper of Moreau's growing influence. Each word is a blade. If Moreau succeeded, if Charles truly embraced his vision of tolerance, Isabella's entire system of power, built on fear, secrecy, and manipulation, would crumble. Worse still, Charles might become a king who no longer needed his mother. For Isabella, this was not politics, it was survival. And so she began to craft her most audacious plan yet. In public, she spoke of peace. In private, she sharpened daggers. Her daughter, Marguerite, was to be wed to Henry of Navarre, a Protestant prince. The union was presented as a grand reconciliation. Catholics and Protestants joined in marriage, a symbol that the kingdom could live together in harmony. Paris prepared for the celebration. Streets were hung with banners, fountains ran with wine, and inns overflowed with Huguenot nobles arriving for the festivities. They came with their wives and children, believing themselves honored guests of the crown. But Isabella knew better. The wedding was bait. For months, Isabella planned with a precision that would make a general proud. She ordered lists drawn of every Protestant household in Paris, every visiting noble, every potential target. She ensured Catholic militias were armed and ready. She had the city gates prepared to close, locking prey inside the trap. But there was still one obstacle: her son. Charles hesitated. Night after night, Isabella found him packing, his fingers drumming against windowsills, his face pale with doubt. He muttered of sin, of conscience, of the stain such an act would leave on France. And each night, Isabella worked upon him as surely as any poison. She began gently with suggestions, rumors of Protestant plots, whispers of betrayal, then with forged documents carefully crafted by her agents, showing supposed letters of conspiracy. She spoke of Mauro not as a loyal subject but as a hidden usurper, plotting to seize the throne. Her words dripped slowly, like water on stone, carving fear into Charles's heart. "You are king," she told him one night, her voice low, almost tender. "But they do not see you as king. They see you as a boy they can bend. Mauro means to take from you what is yours. Will you let him?" Charles clenched his fists. "He is loyal." "Loyal men do not gather armies under their own banners," she replied. "Loyal men do not speak of freedom from royal authority. He means to rule in your place, my son. And if you do not strike first, he will strike you." The young king shuddered. Fear was spreading in him, cold and corrosive. Within weeks, Isabella had turned doubt into terror, and terror, finally, into obedience. Charles gave the order. On August 22nd, 4 days after the wedding, Admiral Mauro walked through the narrow streets near the Louvre. The summer air was heavy, the sky low with clouds. Suddenly, a shot cracked from a window. The bullet struck him but did not kill him. He staggered, bleeding, carried by his men to his lodgings. Paris buzzed with whispers. An assassination attempt. Was it random? Was it fate? Or was it the opening move in Isabella's design? Mauro, gravely wounded, lay in bed. Huguenot leaders crowded his chamber, demanding justice. Their voices rose, echoing down stone corridors. Outside, Catholic militias gathered, restless, armed. The city was a powder keg. Isabella held the match. In the early hours of August 24th, St. Bartholomew's Day, the bells of Saint Germain-l'Auxerrois began to toll. The signal had come. Doors splintered, steel flashed, screams pierced the night. Admiral Mauro was dragged from his bed and butchered, his body hurled from a window. His bloodied corpse lay in the street, desecrated by the mob. And then the killing spread. Huguenot nobles were cut down in their chambers. Families were dragged from their homes. Women and children begged in the streets, only to be struck where they knelt. The Seine filled with bodies, its waters running red. Some tried to flee, but the city gates had been sealed. Paris was a trap, and Isabella had sprung it perfectly. From the Louvre's high windows, Isabella is said to have watched. Did she smile? Did she pray? No one knows. History records only that she moved calmly through the palace as chaos reigned outside, ensuring her children were guarded, ensuring her orders were followed. By dawn, thousands lay dead. By week's end, tens of thousands more across France would perish as news spread and Catholic factions unleashed their fury. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, as it would be called, was not an accident of rage. It was design, Isabella's design. When the blood finally dried, the balance of power had shifted. The Huguenot leadership was shattered. Admiral Mauro was gone. King Charles, though haunted by nightmares, clung to his mother more tightly than ever, convinced she had saved him from ruin. Europe shuddered. Some monarchs condemned the slaughter. Others secretly admired its efficiency, and Isabella Valmont's name spread in whispers across courts and kingdoms, the Poison Regent who had turned a wedding into a massacre. Pause here and think of it. A mother orchestrating the deaths of her son's closest advisors, convincing him it was for his own survival. A queen who turned joy into terror with the tolling of bells. What does it mean to rule by fear? To preserve power not with love, not with loyalty, but with blood. Isabella had her answer. She had secured her throne, but the cost would echo through France for generations. The massacre of 1572 had secured Isabella Valmont's place as the most feared woman in Europe. Yet victories of such brutality leave scars that power alone cannot heal. In the days that followed, Paris smelled of smoke, blood, and wet stone. The Seine carried bodies as silently as it carried barges of grain, and though Catholic factions hailed the slaughter as divine triumph, others recoiled. Allies who once whispered loyalty now whispered unease. Even the Vatican, which had long despised the Protestants, raised an eyebrow at the scale of Isabella's cruelty. But the most dangerous consequence was not abroad. It was at home, within the walls of the Louvre itself. King Charles, her son, had given the order, but it was Isabella who had written every line of the script. And as the bells of Saint Germain still rang in his ears, Charles began to crumble beneath the weight of what he had done. He could not sleep without waking in terror. He paced palace corridors whispering names of the dead, insisting their ghosts followed him. At meals, he would drop his goblet suddenly, certain that the wine was poisoned, though none dared raise a hand against him. At times he screamed in the night, calling his mother a demon, a sorceress, the true author of the bloodshed. Isabella watched her son disintegrate, and for once, patience did not soothe her. This was the king she had molded, and he was unraveling. If Charles was faltering, Isabella had other sons waiting in the wings. Her second surviving son, Henry, Duke of Anjou, was clever, ambitious, and charming in ways Charles never could be. He had already made a name for himself on the battlefield. He was the sort of prince who could win a crowd with a smile or dismantle an enemy with calculation. Isabella doted on him, grooming him for a crown she increasingly doubted Charles could hold. Her third son, Francois, Duke of Alençon, was younger, restless, and far less reliable. Where Henry was disciplined, Francois was reckless. Yet even he could be useful, another piece on the board of dynastic survival. Isabella maneuvered between her sons like a chess master playing both sides of the board, reminding each of them that their futures depended on her. She fed Charles just enough affection to keep him tethered, whispered promises of destiny into Henry's ear, and dangled hope before Francois whenever ambition threatened to lead him astray. But even the Poison Regent could not control the toll that guilt was taking on her eldest. By 1574, Charles's body was failing him as quickly as his mind. Blood seeped from his lungs when he coughed, staining his sleeves crimson. His rages became unpredictable, his paranoia uncontainable. At 23, the boy king was already a dying man. When he finally succumbed, Isabella wept publicly, but in the shadows her eyes were dry. Another son would wear the crown, and she would remain the hand that guided it. Henry ascended as King Henry III, bringing with him the charisma and political cunning that Isabella had always admired. Yet ruling France was no gentler in his hands than it had been in Charles's. The kingdom was still fractured by religion, still haunted by the massacre Isabella had orchestrated, still torn between Catholic hardliners and Protestant reformers. Henry's reign was marked by intrigue, factions, and rebellion, and through it all, Isabella remained at his side, less regent now, but no less influential. When Henry traveled, she governed in his absence. When factions plotted, she reminded him which enemies could be bought and which should be buried. But Henry was no puppet. He had learned his mother's lessons too well. Though he listened to her counsel, he also learned to wield manipulation as deftly as she had. For the first time, Isabella found herself less the master, more the partner. It was a new role and not one she relished. By the 1580s, Isabella Valmont was no longer the youthful queen consort mocked as a banker's daughter. She was an old woman now, her face lined, her hands frail but her mind as sharp as ever. The French people had long ceased to underestimate her. Instead, they whispered in fear. They called her the Italian serpent. They called her the Black Queen. Most famously, they called her the Poison Regent. Some said she carried vials of venom sewn into her gowns. Others swore she kept astrologers chained in her chambers, consulting the stars before every decision. Few dared to question her directly, but everyone believed the same thing. Isabella Valmont's reach extended farther than any sword, and her shadow fell on every chamber in the kingdom. Her enemies accused her of orchestrating not just murders but entire wars. Admirers, fewer in number, admitted grudging respect. Without her ruthless cunning, France might have collapsed entirely during its decades of religious war. But power, like poison, corrodes from within. By 1589, Isabella's health was failing. She had outlived 3 of her sons, countless rivals, and nearly everyone who had once mocked her arrival in France. Henry III remained, but his crown was precarious, threatened by assassins and factions that Isabella's stratagems could no longer fully control. On January 5th, Isabella Valmont died in Blois at the age of 69. Some said it was pneumonia. Others swore it was poison, the irony of a woman undone by her own favored weapon. But in truth, it was simply the slow unraveling of a body that had carried too much ambition for too many years. Her funeral was marked by pageantry, yet her absence was noted in silence more than grief. For decades she had been both shield and sword, savior and executioner. With her gone, France faced its storms without the steadying and suffocating hand of the Poison Regent. Isabella Valmont's story has lived on in whispers, chronicles, and legends. Historians debate her every choice. Was she a monster who drowned her kingdom in blood? Or was she a survivor who kept France from shattering entirely under the weight of its divisions? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. She was a woman born powerless in a world that offered women nothing but dismissal. She was mocked, humiliated, sidelined, yet she turned every slight into fuel. She taught herself to wield the tools men ignored: patience, rumor, silence, poison. She made invisibility her greatest weapon. Perhaps her greatest lesson is this: history is not always shaped by generals on horseback or kings in council halls. Sometimes it is shaped by a woman standing quietly in the shadows, waiting for her moment, and taking it with both hands when it comes. And though centuries have passed since Isabella Valmont walked the halls of France, her name, her legend, still clings to the air like incense and smoke. The Poison Regent, the queen who taught Europe never to underestimate a woman armed not with armies but with patience and with poison.